Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. The Prime Minister met with his American and Mexican counterparts to discuss trade, migration, and climate change against the backdrop of a big loss by the United States under the new NAFTA. Mexico and Canada teaming up to push back on the Americans' rules of origins on auto parts.
We're not looking for win-lose scenarios, but win-win-wins. That's what NAFTA is.
All three countries looking to create stronger ties, particularly in the face of global uncertainty. Let's bring in our panelists. Chantal Hebert, Andrew Coyne, Althia Raj, and joining us this week, the CBC's Wherry. Good to see everybody. Appreciate you being here. I'm going to start with you, Andrew, in terms of what you thought that meeting and I guess that ruling too about under the new NAFTA, what that tells us about the state of the relationship between these three nations and sort of Canada's place in it.
Well, to me, I guess it's an interesting question is we're going to find out what friend-shoring means. You know, that term came into vogue as an alternative to onshoring, i.e., okay, we live in a changed world, we're not so keen on trading with Russia or China anymore, we don't want to be exposed to them, but we don't want to just go the other extreme and just go protectionist and have every country just making everything itself and not trading with its neighbors. So the idea was friend-shoring is we'll trade with our friends, with the democracies and like-minded countries. Well, in the context of the continent of North America, that's a rather smaller group than just the democracies. And while it's perfectly fair for Canada and Mexico to be worried about American unilateral protectionism and to fight back against that, I would hope we don't replace that with continental protectionism. And some of the rhetoric you hear from some quarters suggests that that's really where we should be going now is not only integrating continentally, but making it sort of ourselves against the rest of the world. I hope we don't go in that direction.
Chantal, is that a real concern based on what you've heard over the past couple of days, do you think?
Well, it's interesting that back in the days, the early days of NAFTA, there was a fear outside of North America about the building of Fortress North America. Now, the signals this week from Canada came in both directions in the sense that, yes, the summit did show that the world has changed and it gives more impetus to the relationship between North American partners. But then the notion that the Prime Minister will be leading a Team Canada visit to Japan also sends a different kind of signal, which is that we are rekindling or reinforcing a relationship that kind of had fallen by the wayside because of the heavy energy investment onto the China market.
And Althia, that ruling that we heard, we don't have to get into the details obviously, but the fact that Canada and Mexico teamed up to send a signal to the U.S. that they were willing only to accept, a certain amount of protectionism, I wonder if that bodes badly for Biden or for the future of NAFTA, given that this is a complicating factor with a president that the Prime Minister gets along with.
I don't think so. I mean, I think that the White House must have expected that Ottawa would join or not launch if Mexico hadn't done it first. This complaint, because it seems like it wasn't actually what the governments, all three of them, had negotiated. It wasn't what was understood to be the case. So, of course, Ottawa would try to argue the rules in its favor as opposed to Washington's favor. I think that's completely understandable. To me, I think what was interesting from the summit is that the warm relationship between Justin Trudeau and President Biden is pretty clear. The threat is really about the new Congress and about what a potentially, a likely new president in 2026. Maybe not. Maybe Joe Biden will run again and win. What that would mean to renegotiating NAFTA, because we can't forget, of course, that when we did sign this NAFTA 2.0, there's supposed to be a review in 6 years. And so everything that is being discussed could possibly be under threat again. So it's important that everybody is kind of singing from the same songbook, even though there are obviously going to be squabbles about certain parts of the agreement. We lost on dairy, for example, so we're not always winning.
No. Aaron.
I mean, this trade dispute, I don't know, maybe I'm still shell-shocked from the years 2016 to 2020, but it seems positively quaint compared to what happened then. And the other thing I think here to note too, speaking of those years between 2016 and 2020, is that these meetings are happening. They didn't happen for 4 years. But I think Althia is right that looking forward to 2026 and the possibility of this deal being reviewed, Canada obviously has interest not only in these meetings happening, but in there being some sort of positive sentiment or vibe about this deal. But I think the piece kind of looking forward to, at least from Canada's side, and I think it gets into the friendshoring idea, is the Prime Minister's pretty keen on this idea of Canada being a supplier to the world of critical minerals and resources in a net zero economy. And obviously for Canada and for the Prime Minister's interest, it would help if the United States and Joe Biden were, not only on board, but were also kind of helping to make that a reality. So I think that, as we look forward to the meeting in March between the President and the Prime Minister, I think that's kind of the piece I'm most interested in.
Well, and speaking of that meeting, Andrew, I mean, obviously it is largely symbolic, but I think you would hope that that kind of meeting would also result in some of what Aaron is talking about, some way of sort of setting up a place where Canada becomes a source with critical minerals for the U.S. and for the world, and as he says, that the President support that.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister has ambitions beyond that I'm not sure I share in terms of making us a big battery powerhouse and advanced technology of that kind that may or may not be in our wheelhouse. But he'll be, the issue continues to be the massive subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act, which are troublesome not just to us, but to a lot of countries around the world. I know there are some people who are spoiling for a subsidy war with the United States, and that I'm not sure that's necessarily in our best interest. But he's obviously got to try and temper that. And also just show that normalcy works for both sides. We're always going to have disputes in the United States with a Democrat or a Republican president. There's always going to be protectionist impulses, but at least we can resolve them or confront them in a normal fashion. That was what was so missing in the 2016-2020 period, was you just had no idea what was going to happen next.
Chantal, quickly, yeah.
Still, if you were going to test NAFTA as it was renegotiated in hostile circumstances, that victory bodes well in the sense that we didn't give away the shop even in those circumstances. And that is something that got done on Justin Trudeau's watch.
Right. Last word to you quickly, Althia.
I think what's important to remember is that we are actually not a problem for Washington. And so for President Biden to devote as much time as he does to Canada is a pretty impressive thing. The fact that he's coming likely the third week of March. And, it's normal that we have irritants like Nexus, like the Safe Third Country Agreement. I think some people would wonder why that's not getting solved as quickly as you think that it might be with a simpatico administration at the White House. But I think part of the problem is the world is on fire, and here's this safe beacon that's not really causing trouble. So why deal with the irritants when there's bigger things to deal with?
Former Finance Minister Bill Morneau has some blunt criticism of his former boss and the government in his new memoir. Morneau details his 5 years as finance minister in his book, including criticisms about how cabinet's put together, the power of the Prime Minister's office, pandemic spending, and what he calls the Prime Minister's management and interpersonal communication abilities, which he describes as sorely lacking. So what's to be made of the former finance minister's comments? How potentially damaging could it be for the government? Let's bring in at issue Chantal Hebert, Andrew Coyne, Althia Raj, and the CBC's Wherry. Aaron, I'll start with you as I promised, because you didn't get a last turn on the first round. What do you make of what we've heard so far? And I should say that the access to the book has been pretty limited thus far, so I don't know if anyone's read it on the panel, but we've certainly seen excerpts of things and reports on what's in it. So what do you make of his criticism of the government and the Prime Minister?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack. The criticism of the Prime Minister, I think, is interesting. Look, if you talk to people who work with the Prime Minister, who have worked with the Prime Minister, you'll hear good things and you'll hear some constructive criticism, I guess. For instance, you'll hear that he's a very, I've had people tell me he's a very adept and thoughtful chair of cabinet. Now, that doesn't necessarily contradict Mr. Morneau's account, no. But it's a complicated picture, I guess. And as much as Bill Morneau is raising concerns that I think, in some cases, even the Prime Minister has acknowledged in terms of his relationship with cabinet ministers and his relationship with caucus, there are some things there for the Prime Minister and his office, I think, probably to reflect on. I would like to hear some more reflection, I think, from Mr. Morneau about his own political career and his own performance. I think it's striking that the three cabinet ministers who have left sort of the loudest, I guess, Bill Morneau, Jane Philpott, and Jody Wilson-Raybould, were all non-politicians before they got into cabinet. And they seem to have come away feeling that there was too much politics in our politics. And I think in some cases they're really just complaining about the way democracy works. I do think it is, valuable to have that perspective and to hear about what they've seen and what they would change about it. But I would be interested to hear, for instance, from Bill Morneau on something like the small business tax fight. I don't know that was Justin Trudeau's fault, and I would be interested to hear sort of Bill Morneau's reflections on what he would have done differently in situations like that.
And again, that could be in the book. We don't know because we haven't gotten it yet. Chantal, I mean, there's a public policy criticism, I think, that it seems broad in the book that is probably useful for reflection, and then there's also these sort of personal criticisms. What did you make?
A couple of points. If Mr. Morneau feels that Justin Trudeau is sorely lacking in those interpersonal skills, I don't know how we would have fared under Stephen Harper or Jean Chrétien. Because neither was a cuddly type of prime minister. I think you have to go back to Brian Mulroney to find one who was more into that. But the other public policy criticism, fine. Reflection, fine, except that Bill Morneau was the finance minister, and I must have missed the moment when he resigned on a matter of principle, because that did not happen. And it's a bit rich, having resigned, to now turn back and say, I forgot to mention that one of the reasons I left was because I had become someone who was powerless to stop a train wreck on the fiscal front. If that's how we felt, he could have said so. That those were not the circumstances of his leaving.
No, he resigned, just to remind people, after or during the WE scandal as part of all of that. Althia.
I'm not sure that he actually even resigned because of the WE scandal. I think he really resigned because the Prime Minister's office was basically pushing him out the door and leaking against him. And Mark Carney had been brought in as an advisor, a few days before that, or that was made public. I would go back to something that Aaron said, because I find that the most striking. Bill Morneau, Jane Philpott, Jody Wilson-Raybould, they're not the only ones, but they are the key cabinet ministers that were recruited as candidates who were not part of the Liberal Party family. They were not, well-known volunteers in the party. They had not lived and breathed that Team Red, and they seem to have really struggled in recognizing that politics is a team sport, and that politics is not just about public policy and designing the best public policy, but it's also about strategic partisan political calculations. If you want to stay in power and get to power, so much of it is about what is popular, what the public is going to respond to. And so and again, I have not read the book. The publisher insists on sending me a print copy, which has not arrived in my mailbox yet. So I don't want to read too much into it. But from what I've read in the excerpts I've read, I find that really striking, that they, even with all that has happened, they still cannot recognize that that's really what politics is about. That to me was a big takeaway from the excerpt so far.
I mean, there's one part where apparently he says something like the Prime Minister's office told him just to sort of dole out goodies to people to keep them happy when it came to budget time.
Cabinet minister is
that to me is something like, maybe I'm just too cynical and have been here too long, but that to me is not surprising information. But Andrew, go ahead and give us your take.
Well, there's much in the book that isn't terribly surprising to hear. That they, for example, that they favored image over substance and politics over policy, that they spent too much in the pandemic, that they are kicking healthcare down the can. All those are well known. It's just news, perhaps, that he said it. The stuff that I do find more interesting, and some of my fellow panelists have homed in on it, is I wouldn't say so much it's the relationship between him and Trudeau as the relationship between cabinet ministers and the Prime Minister. This is a concern that long predates the current government, that power has been excessively centralized in the Prime Minister's office, and in particular in unelected Prime Minister's officials. You get some people pushing back on that and saying, oh, this is exaggerated, it's overblown, but it keeps getting confirmed by people who've actually been there. This Prime Minister came in saying, well, actually, you know, this is cabinet government is back after the bad old days of Stephen Harper, but by all accounts, it's been even more centralized under this. And you can say that the people who've complained are people who weren't part of the system, didn't grow up in the Liberal Party, et cetera, and paint them as naifs who don't understand how politics works. Or you can say they weren't people who'd self-selected themselves to accommodate themselves to that kind of system, who'd had any kind of independence of mind beaten out of them. They were people who were accomplished in their own right before they went into politics, and were maybe able to view it a little more dispassionately. I don't think anybody pretends that there shouldn't be politics in politics, or that there shouldn't be, you know, powerful prime ministers, et cetera. The question has always been, have we taken things too far in this country? Have we allowed power to become so centralized? Have we allowed politics to become so cynical that the actual public purpose and democratic principles are getting lost in the mix? Yeah. So I think it's a bit rich to present Bill Morneau or Jody Wilson-Raybould or Jane Philpott as being sort of the sort of village idiots of the piece who just didn't understand how politics work. I think that's a grotesque misrepresentation of what actually happened.
Chantal.
Without going to that depiction, the fact is that Bill Morneau stands out as a finance minister who, on the day of his appointment, had never sat for one day in a seat in an elected house at the provincial or the federal level. Now, it may be that running a country and being part of a cabinet and being in politics is the only business in this country that doesn't have a learning curve that you can just step into and you're going to be good at it. But what the course of Bill Morneau suggests, in particular, is that if he'd had more time, possibly in opposition, to get the lay of the land, he would not have had so much trouble over We Charity, the house in whatever European country, or even the small business tax selling exercise. And I think he did suffer from having to learn the job on the job.
Yeah, for sure. And a hard job too. Althia.
So I'm not suggesting they're village idiots. And to be frank, like, I think, you know, myself, you, Andrew, Chantal, Rosie, and Aaron, I don't know you enough to say this, but I think we would be terrible caucus members because we are very independently minded and we would have a hard time putting water in our wine and compromising on things we felt very strongly about. But we know that about ourselves. And that's just what I mean in terms of seeing things in a certain, like, rose-colored way after the fact. Now, I will fervently disagree about the centralization of power under Justin Trudeau. Yes, power is centralized in the Prime Minister's office, but life under Justin Trudeau as a Prime Minister is very different for a Cabinet Minister than life under Stephen Harper. Cabinet Ministers under Trudeau have a lot longer leash than, sometimes maybe they shouldn't, but they do have a lot longer leash than they did under Stephen Harper. And some people in Mr. Harper's cabinet were allowed, you know, to have great independence, and there are some people in Justin Trudeau's cabinet who are allowed to have great independence. But overall, you know, not all speeches are vetted by somebody in the Prime Minister's office. There is it is freer in some ways, if you'd like. The other thing I think is worth noting is I think we should have good tension between the Finance Minister and the Prime Minister's office. I think it's important that there is tension, and perhaps one of the criticisms that we can levy between Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau at the moment is maybe there isn't enough tension. Like, we should have vigorous debate about public spending at the cabinet table, and I'm not sure that it is there at the moment.
Yeah, I would say it depends on who the minister is in terms of how much freedom you have. I think you suggested that too, but that
was also true of Jim Flaherty, for instance, under Stephen Harper. He had a lot more leeway than others in the cabinet. That doesn't mean that he always got his way, though.
No. Last word to Aaron.
Yeah, on Bill Morneau, look, I think he was treated very poorly. I think it was one of the uglier chapters of this government's time in office on his way out. And so he has every reason to feel bitter about that. But if he's going to kind of reflect, I think some of that needs to be inward looking. On the Prime Minister, the issue on relationships, I think it's less about power and more it really is about relationships. I think the Prime Minister, having never served in government before and having only served in some pretty small caucuses, had never really thought about how much emphasis to put on caucus and cabinet and him personally building those relationships. And I don't think anyone ever told him that he needed to do that. And so I think that is, that's the part of Morneau's criticism that I think rings true to me.
Okay, thank you all. That was a good conversation.